I think there is an element of structural issues that when it comes to city governance and city governments, it's exacerbated, I think, by the political party system, which makes it a chronic issue and very, very difficult to resolve. You have constitutional issues that very clearly across states, you can see that city governments are not being bestowed with the autonomy that they need to have. The allocation is not dependent on the quality of your MLA. Right? Your MLA is not fighting for allocation. Your MLA is not presenting a list of demands and saying, I want my constituency projects to get these kind of priorities. Come one level below to the local government, it is much worse. Local governments have absolutely no sort of fiscal discipline, if you will. They don't have a balance sheet, profit and loss that is audited and visible to the public. They don't have their revenues tied to their expenditure.
This is so bad. I don't even know how to ask the next question. So citizens in large agglomerations are at their wits' end trying to get relief from disorganized civic agencies across the country. Their only recourse is their political representatives, who don't seem to necessarily have a permanent fix, or they appease their immediate requests but fail to fix things for the long haul. So what are their incentives, right? Many cities across the country, for example, starting with Bengaluru, where we are sitting and talking, don't have a city government for the past few years, right? Why don't we have it? Do our politicians really care? So let's discuss this with Tara, who has joined us, who has spent decades in elections, policy, federalism, ward committees, urban governance, and gender justice. She is the co-founder of Political Shakti, a non-partisan volunteer collective to increase women's role in politics. She has also been a consultant for election campaigns of the MP of Karur constituency in Tamil Nadu and the MLA of Jayanagar constituency in Bengaluru. So she brings a rich expertise to the table, having worked within the political system. I know her from the Citizens for Bengaluru times when she has worked on a lot of urban mobility and other issues as well. Tara, this is where I'm trying to start this conversation, because I don't think politicians care for the city necessarily, but I think they do care for their electoral outcomes, and somehow we have to hope that those two match in some way. So let's start with this thing. Do you really think they care? As care as in care for living in the city and care for the citizens who live in that city?
First of all, thank you for having me at OoruLabs, Sathya. It's a pleasure, and I am looking forward to the conversation. Do politicians care for the city? Certainly, there are some politicians elected in the city who have been born and raised in the city, right? Some of them live here and think of outside the city as their native places, if you will. But there are certainly city politicians who are hardcore urban gents and ladies, if you will, right? They are city folk. And they have a certain ownership of the city as well. You know, in addition to attributing any kind of ill will or bad faith, which we will kind of stay away from, because there's always one can always assign a lot of things to bad faith. That doesn't help sort of solve the problem. And also, I think since 1992, 93, the 94, the 73rd, 74th Amendment, we have had more than 25 years of elections across various cities, across India, across various parties. And we'd be hard pressed to say that any particular city is well run overall. Right? So cities are in general beleaguered with very similar issues in terms of water and drainage and garbage and transport, and then the safety and livability in general of the city, usability of the city. So there is enough of sort of a randomized experiment, if you will, to say that, you know, it's not about particular parties or ideologies or individuals. I think there is an element of structural issues that when it comes to city governance and city governments that the participants themselves are keenly aware of. And it's exacerbated, I think, by the political party system, which makes it a chronic issue and very, very difficult to resolve.
We usually do this, right? We go to the bureaucrats who are the first line of defense, the administrative entities, which basically, let's take the example of Bengaluru, as like the BBMP, the corporation, city corporation, the municipal corporation in various cities. This is the first line of cry. We go there and say, look, we are expecting a better quality of service than what we are getting. Why don't you buck up and give it to us? Of course, at the end of the day, they are not accountable to us directly, even though we might want them to. They are accountable to their political masters, the cabinet, the ministers who rule the state, that have been elected through the process. And they is who we have to go to, right? Now, how much of the political problems are because of an inefficient and a lagging bureaucracy? Because they ultimately have to do the job as well. Where do you think the politicians' frustrations lie when it comes to getting things done at the corporation level?
I alluded to structural issues. So, on the one hand, the law itself is, the 93rd, 94th Amendments, at a certain point start to talk about what the state may do as opposed to what the state must do, making it very distinctive in the federal structure, right? When it comes to state level governance, the constitution is pretty clear as to what the state must do. But when it comes to local bodies of any sort, there is a may in especially with the urban local bodies, the city governments, there is a may for fundamental things from conducting elections, the manner of elections, to the manner of, fiscal sort of budgeting for the city governments themselves, and the powers and authorities that they get to have, which is the broad range of everything under a government. So, you have constitutional issues that very clearly across states, you can see that city governments are not being bestowed with the autonomy that they need to have. Secondly, because it is that way, you have this odd situation of the sort of Indian teenager, if you will, who wants to have all the privileges and no responsibilities. You have the Western teenager who has to take responsibility for discretionary spending. There is a certain degree of earning they need to have. There's a certain degree of chores they need to do, right, in order to be able to earn some privileges. In India, our family structures are such that they have all the privileges and little responsibility, if you will. So I think urban local governments are very similar to that, in that it's an odd case. In fact, I would say even state governments are similar to that, where they don't need to take responsibility for their fiscal performance. There is so much of, in many states, the state revenues are simply inadequate and are a fraction of their budgets, and they rely entirely on the Central Finance Commission devolutions, including, grants and other sort of endowments, if you will, rather than generating revenues from bottom up. I think what happens in those cases is that the politicians, coming to the politics of it, there is simply no clear line of relationship between the growth and development of the local economy, whatever local is defined as, whether it's a ward, whether it's a state, and your outcomes to the public, your responsibility to citizens, and your electoral outcomes. For example, you and I have no idea how much forget at the city government level, even our MLA has control over what happens in our constituency, right? Because budgets are, first of all, at the state level. In many states, the revenues aren't important, right? So you're getting money from the Finance Commission. Secondly, at the constituency level, the allocation is not dependent on the quality of your MLA. Right? Your MLA is not fighting for allocation. Your MLA is not presenting a list of demands and saying, I want my constituency projects to get these kind of priorities. Instead of the lakhs of crores of budget that the state has, that the MLA fights for, or consequently at the ward level is devolved, you end up having, just the MLA LAD, so to speak, the Local Area Development Fund that drives this. So come one level below to the local government, it is much worse. Local governments have absolutely no sort of fiscal discipline, if you will. They don't have a balance sheet, profit and loss that is audited and visible to the public. They don't have their revenues tied to their expenditure to say that, if you earn X, of course, you can borrow Y amount as well, provided that you have an audited balance sheet, and X plus Y is the amount that you can spend, right? It is not, it is the opposite of that which happened, right? So the cities, for example, in India contribute to almost 2/3 of India's GDP, right? 50 to 66% of India's GDP, while hardly a third to 40% of the population lives in the cities. So imagine the cities contributing 2/3 of India's GDP, but that is not the level of funds that's devolved to the cities, right? Most of it goes into rural areas. So it is very clear, whether it is to the citizens, to the city government representatives elected and unelected, or even at the state level, that there is no direct line of connection between my demands, their fulfillment of the demands, their ability to generate the budget and fulfill those demands, and the consequent electoral outcome. So in a structurally broken system, it is kind of, a toss-up, whether a particular bureaucrat or a corporator, a councillor, responds to you well or doesn't respond to you well. It is not proportional to their delivery, their ability to deliver. That is outside their control.
This is so bad, I don't even know how to ask the next question. Okay, let's try to split it out and say the politician does care. Okay, I mean, it's not like he doesn't want to give it. Like you said, let's not put anything out to ill will. It's not that he is deliberately trying not to do something. He's probably clueless at some points, as some people possibly are. Some others find...
This is not to say that they're clueless, that they're caught in a complex web where there isn't a direct way for them to get X amount of finances and fulfill the demands. They still operate. They still try to, if you go and complain to your councillor the lack of water supply, or, complain to your MLA about transportation, then your lack of a local bus stop, they do try to help. They do try to make it happen. There just isn't a direct connection between a prioritized list of demands and the budget that gets allocated and the time frame within which it is done, because of the structural complexity. So despite of that, our cities function. So that's the nature of the politics.
True, but despite that, what it does is there's a lot of subjective decisions that are being taken. There's a lot of discretionary, okay, let's wing this kind of a thing, right? So we go with the project. They don't know where the money is going to come from, but they say, since the elected representative wants to do it, they just haggle on the road, okay, this much will come from MLA led, this one is going to come from Nagarotana scheme. I'll fill the rest, don't worry about it. And if it doesn't come, half the streetlights are gone because, sorry, we got money for the asphalt, the streetlights don't have. We had a case where we had 100 streetlights and allocation for only 20 bulbs. I was like, why would you even go ahead with the 100 streetlights if you didn't have bulbs? So there is the bureaucratic administrative thing, right?
Councillors that think like that. And
really?
Because across India, this is documented because of exactly what you said, which is that city governments do not have control over their finances. They don't know how much grants they're going to get, whether they are guaranteed to get those grants. And regardless of the revenue growth of, say, Bengaluru and BBMP's budgets don't grow proportionally, right? And the budgets are not in their hands, which means what they do when they get the allocation, the councillor says, I am not going to start this project because I don't know if I'm going to be able to complete it. So there is actually unspent money. When we look at the budgets and the fact that there is a 30% or 40% or 20% that is not spent for certain projects, some of it has to do with, we normally just assign it to incompetence, but some of it actually has to do with what you said. They've thought through it and they know that the road extends across 3 wards. And the fact that you have been sanctioned the money and the ward next to it hasn't been sanctioned the money, or may not be sanctioned, or may not be fully sanctioned, means you got to take a call whether you even want to start the project or not.
But how much of this is, I don't want to say political incompetency, but definitely why can't we fix this system? What is the incentive for, and we have, for example, again, we'll take our case because we sit here and we know this, there's a Bengaluru development minister, for example, which has usually been practiced, at least from one of the parties. They've been trying to get this Bengaluru development minister. And then the corporation elections, what is the incentive in not having a full-fledged city government? Yes, the provisions say it is a may provision. You may have it, you may not have it. The courts have always been saying go and do it anyway. So we always rely on the courts to get a city government. What is the incentive for an MLA not to have corporators?
It's a great question. Many cities seem to have a development minister as opposed to a mayor entrusted with sort of an equivalent role, which is what we'd expect as citizens. So I'll go back to the first principles. The first thing is, given that the constitutional amendment is vague, the first question that pops in mind is, what prevents the union government from firming up that constitutional amendment? For 25 years, it has sat there. You cannot imagine running a state in India without timely elections. Let's think about that for a moment. Unless there is a breakdown of law and order machinery, there aren't cases of states that haven't had elections in years and years. It is not possible to do that. And one of the reasons why it's not possible to do that is simply because the constitution is very clear, right? About the fact that within 6 months of the earlier government's tenure ending, you must conduct elections. Now, if we firmed up the constitutional amendment, the 74th Amendment, that would be a given. It is not a discretionary thing. It is not a thing that's in the hands of the state governments to decide, should I have an elected city government now or 5 years later? Instead, you must conduct elections within 6 months. Now, what is the incentive, like you said, for MLAs not to conduct these elections? The sitting state government typically wants to be able to run the city. Cities are, like we said, 2/3 of all of India's GDP comes from cities. So they want to have control over the city because that is the economic engine and that is where the political economy functions. Political economy, a large part of the city's political economy is land use itself, controlling the land in the city, which is one of the most valuable assets. And Indian culture also tends to prioritize land as an asset. So they want to conduct elections at a conducive time for themselves so that they will win, whoever is the sitting government. But how come they don't think about the same thing during state elections? Because that discretion is not there, right? Because the constitution is very concrete. So I think the first thing, if we want to put a stop to this, is that the amendment, which is kind of flawed and broken in a way, if you will, needs to be fixed. That's the bare minimum that needs to happen. The second thing that happens, I think, even when there is sort of the will to do the right thing, the will to conduct elections, or just a conducive setup, what happens, I think there are two things that come in the way. One, as I said, is even if you conduct elections, there is the budgetary issue. The State Finance Commission doesn't devolve or devolves, but it may devolve. Again, you come back to the amendment, the money, and then you come back to the whole budgeting issue. And a city that is not well financed is very difficult to run properly. Projects to happen in a timely fashion, projects to conclude. There's always the pressure on the representatives and on the bureaucracy of unfinished business, of poorly finished business. But even more important that we don't pay attention to is the fact that India's governments, whether it is the central government, state government, or city government, are less than 1/5 the size, even of a government like the US government. Right, less than 1/5 the size. So the proportion of, for every 1 lakh, we have about 1,600 representatives, whereas for every 1 lakh, they have about 7,600 representatives. Added to that, the autonomy of the city governments is such that they don't control their own hiring. BBMP, for example, is running on half the staff, and BBMP doesn't have the decision making in its hands to say, I'm going to hire. Right, the state government has to, approve of that decision. So you don't have the autonomy, you don't have the ability to hire staff, you're at half staff, and you don't have control over your own budget. So the incentive that my ward should do well, and if my ward does well, I'm going to plow back some of that money into the development of my own ward. The people in my ward get to control it, is not there despite mechanisms like the ward committees because of these things. Now, the final thing I will say about it is that our cities are also dominated by the loudest, aka the most privileged voices. So even when all of this comes together, which is you do have elections, you do have a sitting council, when you have, within the constrained budget, there is a certain degree of projects that can be executed. And you have a reasonable council that is, going to listen to you, because elected representatives tend to do that. They want to get elected again. You have a reasonable bureaucracy. Even with all that, we have a significant problem of who is the city for, right? Is it, whose city is this really? Who is the sort of client base that it is seeking to satisfy? I think that's a question we don't spend enough sort of attention.
Why don't we jump into that? Because there are lots of contestations in a city. It is the urban areas is where the economy is. Like you said, the workers are there. People come seeking work. There are various different classes, categories, religions, caste, creeds, everything. It mixes in a city, right? It's not a single trade. There are multiple trades. There are multiple professions, services, goods. So many things happen in a city that it's a microcosm of a country in some way, right? How do the politicians deal with the varied voices? Of course, since there are business houses, and I've complained enough in my life, and you have as well, about disproportionate voices who have economic power. They can wield that. There are disproportionate voices which have connections and closeness to the people who make decisions. And they may or may not acquire it through economic power alone. They may acquire it through other factors like belonging to community, caste, and things like that. These tend to always dominate our conversations. So how does the city and the political class, what are their responsibilities towards ensuring some kind of equity? I'm not asking for a whataboutery here, but is it very skewed in how we hear about it? Being inside, do you think they also look at it differently?
I think human beings are inherently, we have certain degree of blindness. We have blind spots. And I think that particularly gets exacerbated in conditions where there is a clamor for a smaller amount of resources. And cities are cases where you have a great amount of scale, a great amount of size, a great amount of density, a great amount of volume of everything. But the resources that we are clamoring for are relatively less because of the set of problems we already spoke about, right? The fact that we don't have control over it. So whatever we are allocated are completely disproportionate to the size and scale and density of the volume of the problems that the cities face, which means there's a clamor and the loudest voice gets heard. And like you rightly said, you have both the power of wealth and the power of privilege, if you will, that privilege being anything, being closeness to power, being caste, being anything, gender. That tends to dictate these voices. If you look at what happens as soon as every new Karnataka government is elected, and this is why I say there are some patterns that different cities follow, and in different cities, the patterns are different. Mm-hmm. There's a distinct difference if you go to a Mumbai versus a Bangalore in the placement of the city, what drives the city, what tends to get priority versus in Bangalore, versus in Chennai, versus in Hyderabad. One of the things that we see, regardless of who is elected in Bangalore, which state government is elected in Bangalore, is that the first Bengaluru specific meeting that they have, that the development minister has, is typically with the captains of the industry who are venerable figures who probably have assets in the tens of thousands of crores or more that I may not be aware of, which means they haven't spent a single day in the last 30 years ever boarding a bus, ever getting into a metro, ever having to cross the road, multiple times, maybe walking a couple of kilometers, ever having to navigate the labyrinths of BBMP and being shunted from one sort of parastatal to another without accountability. And yet they are the biggest influencers in the prioritization of a city. I think what has happened in Bangalore is you can see, if you step back and look at some of these things, you can see a pattern of things happening. Okay, so first I will talk to you about the symptoms and then we'll catch the patterns from the symptoms. This is one of the symptoms, right? And the symptom of consulting, the richest and the, top 0.001% of the population of the country, right, that resides in Bangalore, is that it's highly influenced from a commercial and wealth-oriented standpoint, how to make the city livable for the wealthy. The second pattern that happens when we talk about transport, for example, and what we privilege, there is a lot of argument about bus lanes. There is a lot of argument about cycle lanes. There's a lot of argument about pedestrian rights, right? And people will immediately say, oh, but people cross anywhere on the road, or that sort of thing. So you can see that the city, in addition to moving towards a wealth-oriented setup, has also moved to a setup that privileges certain forms of transport over the other. As in, the city has a sense of where it wants to spend road space. Road space is real estate. Therefore, where it wants to spend real estate, right? So that is another symptom that we see. The third symptom that you see the minute you say, mobility needs to be universal, mobility needs to be accessible, mobility needs to be for all, is the pushback on sort of a freebie or charging for mobility, or in other words, commercialization has a lot of value in Bengaluru. You just don't see that kind of argument in a Mumbai or a Chennai, right? The commercialization of public services. So I will even further broaden it to say that the public goods as a service, as opposed to sort of charging for it and, commercializing it and paying for itself, the economic aspect of a public service, there is just a lot of conversation about that, which I feel is also connected to the technocratic sort of solutions that we see. There is a lot of influence in Bangalore of not just the wealthy, of not just the commercial, of not just the privileged, but also of technocratic orientation towards solutioning in the city, as opposed to a public good, public service orientation of provisioning in the city. The other symptom you see is that, and if you Bangalore, the development ministers will often make a statement that says, we are not a slum city, unlike a Mumbai, unlike a Delhi, unlike a Chennai, unlike, other cities. And it couldn't be farther from the truth, right? You have 800 notified slums and you have more than 2,500 not notified slums, right? And how do we know this? We know this from various NGOs and academic studies that have been conducted to actually look at physical slums versus just what the slum board notifies. So we have this blindness that says we are a certain kind of a city, whereas, a good 1/3 or more population of the city actually lives in slums, and we are not therefore looking at the density issues, the various different issues there. Recently, yet another symptom appeared, and this is appearing in multiple cities. Before the Delhi election, the incumbent government there made a promise saying that if we get elected, we will devolve more funds to RWAs for them to manage their own sort of welfare associations, their own pieces of property, pieces of real estate, I'll call it, right? Each RWA is a piece of real estate, if you will. It's a set of homes or a set of apartments, but it's really a piece of real estate, a certain number of square feet, right? And the government made a promise to increase RWA devolutions, treat RWAs, which have no constitutional validity or standing, but as units to which budget will be devolved. In a very similar fashion, in Bengaluru recently, we've seen an announcement that says, shall we devolve the management of lakes, the management of parks to the local RWAs, right? On the one hand, there is an argument in favor of it that says, you walk into an RWA, you see that the roads are better managed inside the RWA. You see that there's better lighting, there's better, say, crime is far less in the RWA. There is better water supply, better sort of garbage management. You don't have garbage strewn everywhere. You see that some of the community-run lakes and, parks are better maintained. The argument against it, of course, is that take any city and walk around your neighborhood. Every neighborhood has slums. And you will see that the areas, the non-slum areas, which are typically fall under one sort of welfare association or the other, or apartment complex or the other, have better roads, better lighting, better water, even where they are public goods. Whereas the slum itself has nearly no drainage, not pakka roads, right? You have wires all over the place, just electricity being kind of drawn from the main line. You may not even have running water, or you may have taps in front of the homes as opposed to, running water. And certainly the toilets are not proportional to the number of people that stay there. So you would think that a government would want to devolve more funds to the Slum Welfare Association or to the parts of the ward that need the basic amenities, and not to the parts of the ward that already have basic amenities. In fairness, the parts of the ward that have basic amenities, many of us are paying double charges. We are paying the maintenance to the apartment complex to get the water, right? We are paying the maintenance for the garbage management inside, right? We are already paying that, and we are paying the city taxes, and city taxes are higher than in rural areas. Despite that multiple taxation, right? The fact that governments repeatedly want to prioritize what already works better from a public good perspective, it having been privatized or semi-privatized, and don't want to, I mean, one way to look at it is to say if the RWA is taking care of itself and the people are willing to pay double taxes and the people are willing to manage, why won't you divert those funds to the areas that don't have the basic amenities? But that's not how we're looking at it, right? Also because of the voice, right? The biggest complaints on social media, exacerbated even more by technology. And I come back to technocracy. Right? Often technology increases that Gini coefficient, increases that disparity between the haves and the have-nots. You've had huge arguments for usage of apps for predicting when buses come. And that surely increases the gap between those who don't have data on their and smartphones, as opposed to using digital boards at the bus stops themselves so that everybody is aware of what time the bus comes. So I think there's a range of symptoms. Where I'm going with this is you can repeatedly say that, we are blind to slums. You're blind to women. The acquisition of the new buses by BMTC, we're keenly awaiting the 100 new buses that are going to be inaugurated of the 925 schedule. How many of them are going to be friendly to the disabled, right? Today, the stairs are too high on the buses for the disabled. They're not disabled friendly. You can't take your sort of chair, if you will, on the bus. Many women, despite of Shakti, have complained that the holes on top of the buses are too high up, and some of the electric buses, you tend to fall in them the way they are set up. So we basically have a situation in Bangalore where we are looking at public goods, the design of the public spaces and public services in the city from a corporation and a commercialization perspective, as opposed to as a public service and a welfare. We are looking at it from a technocratic perspective, and that views, that gives you a customer-centric as opposed to a citizen-centric mentality. We are almost rewriting social contracts, right? The privatization of various things rewrites the social contract that I have a right to mobility, that I have a fundamental right to access the public space by saying I'm going to devolve the park or the lake and therefore it's going to be closed from certain hours to certain hours. You've rewritten the social contract of the public space to make it only accessible during certain. Look at what is happening with the protests in Bangalore. Right, we like to thump our chest and say that we have the greatest number of citizen activists per square inch. But the right to assemble freely is a hallmark of a democracy. It's not just yet another fundamental. Fundamental rights themselves are fundamental, right? But this is not yet another fundamental right. Some things are definitive of a democracy, and one is the right to assemble. And we have slowly made this, and this is not recent, right? We have gone from you could protest anywhere, specifically at the site where the injustice is happening, to you can protest only in a town hall or a certain places with the permission of the police, to you can protest only at Freedom Park or only at town hall. So I think and then there is the culture of the government. We need to have small governments, right? Some random sort of a notion that has come about, completely divorced from the data and the evidence that is what the evidence says, which is the same as privileging the privileged, already privileged, right? Where you're not building these cities for the most vulnerable. So I think these are sort of the underlying things that come into play, even where you have elected government, even where you have a budget to manage. I think what drives Bengaluru is makes it worse when you're looking at it from a commercial and not a public good perspective, when you're looking at it purely from an economic and not a service perspective, when you have this, the privilege dictating the city, when you have a rewriting of social contracts, which a lot of people don't understand. They will tell you LCTA is managed so well. Why do you even need to have elected representatives? Simply make every ward managed by, some sort of an unelected body. And magically they think, and they don't even realize. And often, there is also this village in Kerala, which was being run by a corporation, right? You must have heard about it, right? There is a corporation which stood for elections and was running the village in Kerala for a town in Kerala, a municipality in Kerala, for a period of almost 10 years, right? First of all, that corporation came in, created a lot of jobs. They saw exactly the problems you and I are seeing in their own municipality, which is the lack of roads, lack of mobility, lack of safety, crime, etc., and said, we are sick and tired of dealing with the government. So we are going to field our own candidates. We are going to run for office. And the minute they got elected to office, what happened is the symptoms are that some of the services ostensibly improved. The underlying root cause is that you've now privatized a whole bunch of stuff. Roads were privatized. Therefore, access to roads got limited. Suddenly, that public space became accessible only to employees of that corporation. Even your PDS, where your ration shops, got privatized. The quality of goods went up, but everybody didn't have access. The priority went to those who were working in that corporation as janitors or as securities, right? So suddenly the social contract got rewritten, right? So I think that is something in Bangalore that has become egregious, right? Where the social contract has gotten rewritten to the point that we don't even recognize what happens.
Somewhere we are throwing the baby out of the bathwater, I feel. If there are privileged people who can pay a convenience fee to access extra resources, which doesn't burden the government or take that money away from the accountability they have towards the underprivileged, or what we call underprivileged, which is equity in general, and addressing those, I don't see why not. But while that might be a question for how we do this, we end up privatizing in a way that we don't set the guardrails. Like today, all the lakes and the parks have been almost given away to the RWS, whether there is money in it or not. I have been to some of them, and some of the parks are closed to cyclists. They're not even letting us walk through there. And they just say, no, it's only for walkers. And it has been locked. It has been barred for certain types of people they think shouldn't be here. So there is access to services cannot be denied on the basis of who you are. But I think that's a lacuna in how we devolve at all, right? If somebody wants to have a better quality of service, and if they are willing to pay for it and not taxing the resources that might go somewhere else, then I think you should find a way. I can clearly understand some cities have a different culture in how they operate. Bengaluru seems to be quite capitalistic in nature in how the people think, whether it is the economically influential or the politicians who come and the coterie that surrounds that. The size issue was something that I wanted to pick up on is small government is not something that you can have when the government is too small to even carry out the basic tasks, right? When it starts bloating, and what is bloating is you start mapping the amount of work that needs to be done to the capacity that they have, and only then can you talk about small government as a concept. Or if you're conservative and right leaning, you should actually look at efficiencies of governments. Small government is something that came from a different cultural concept where the government was already big and we're delivering effectively. We are so far behind on the maturity curve in being able to deliver services that we need to increase the amount of government staffing. We have IAS officers doing 2-3 departments now. And this doesn't even talk about the lower staffing as to how they are being saddled with all these things. But coming back to how the politicians now deal across the country is quite a large thing to even analyze. The cultural aspects are completely dissimilar. There are cities being governed really nicely. There are others that are not. We just feel we are not governed pretty well, because the minute you see potholes, you think it is not being governed well. How do you put an evaluation framework about whether our city is being governed well? Of course, services are something basic which the bureaucracy is supposed to do. But how do we assign this to the politician? How do we interact with the politician, make him or her care about devolving? Because again, the size comes back to if you need to devolve, you need to actually grow now. The size of the government needs to be a lot more bigger, because at a ward level, you have to deliver so many functions, right? So then how does the politician think about it? How far are we in this curve of politicians looking at city governments and trying to say that I am now not insecure enough to be able to allow this to function and yet be in control, and I put systems in place. Do you even see that happening in the conversations that you've had?
It's one of the famous abolitionists who said that power concedes nothing without a demand, never has, never will. That is the basic premise on which democracy is based, right? Which is people have power, we elect representatives to voice us. So you've kind of touched upon 3 or 4 different things. One is, if we want to have politicians recognize that they need to devolve things, then it needs to be mandated. Relying on the goodwill of people, relying on the sort of the critical analysis and breaking down of large complex functions into smaller functions and devolving those are very subjective, right? And the democracy is a structural thing. The whole purpose of democracy is a peaceful transfer of power, which is only possible if you institutionalize things in a manner that is divorced from the individual party or the individual in power. Meaning, regardless of the party, regardless of their dispensation, their ideology, their leanings, and their failings and their flaws, institutions continue to stay independent, and there is a permanence to it. And if you look at cities, going back to size of government, it is not just a matter of your ideology, right or left or conservative. When we started, we've had 543 seats in terms of parliamentary constituencies and 4,100 and odd assembly constituencies since the last delimitation, right? And since the last delimitation, which was done, we have nearly doubled India's population. So even if you were to agree that we had the perfect number of representatives to begin with, the population has doubled. So at the minimum, you need to keep pace with the population. The second aspect of representation is that if I'm a rural citizen, I get 3 votes where an urban citizen gets 1 vote. I get to vote for my local, Gram Panchayat, Taluk Panchayat at the Zilla level, and I get bureaucratic representation at the district level, in addition to bureaucracies at these 3 levels. I don't get any of them here. Bangalore district representation, I don't know who that is. We never go and approach them. And we don't have anyone except our councillor, right? Between the MLA and the village panchayat, there is 2 other levels. But here, all we have is the ward level. So at any rate, there is a disproportion not only in the economic vitalities between cities and rural areas, there is a inverse problem as far as the actual representation and voice goes. So we need to fix that. And devolution, whether it is of functions, whether it is of money, cannot be basis. Does a politician realize this? They don't need to realize this. They need to follow the law. They need to follow the institutional sort of mandates. And to the extent that we don't put the institutional mandates, the State Finance Commission must devolve. It is not may devolve. And so long as you keep it as may devolve, there is no point in debating whether a particular politician, a particular state does it or not. That is just a matter of time before which it comes or goes. The third thing I'd say is, like you rightly pointed out, when you decide to allocate some of these resources to a section of citizens, whether it is the local RWA, local community to look at the lake or the park, like you said, it can be based on the whims and fancies of individuals and groups that decide who's allowed passage and who's not. Today, even where the lakes and parks are not devolved, even the publicly managed ones, you cannot see Paurakarmikas, for example, our city sanitation workers, when they have to have lunch or breakfast, they don't go and sit in their local park. They sit on the side of the street and eat, right? Which tells you that the local park is not accessible to them. Who wants to sit on the side of the street, right? To your comment that if a private entity, if a private citizen is willing to pay more for better quality services, why? And so long as it doesn't take away from, the rest, shouldn't we be encouraging it? I would say yes, with a caveat. And the caveat is that what they are willing to pay more for cannot be a public good. The road equally belongs to everyone, and I cannot pay more and get more access to it. That basically violates the social contract. Water is everyone's common property. I cannot say that, I will get more water by I will sort of cordon off a portion of that water, right? So long as it's public good, it's a public bus, it cannot be. The fact is that if you prioritize AC buses, if you charge more for buses, let's go back to exactly what you said. There are people like you and me that will pay more for buses. The minute we go down that path, you're now saying that the government can differentially charge, which is good. We can make more money off of some people. But that needs to be caveated with the priority then cannot be acquiring AC buses at the cost of acquiring ordinary buses. Because then you're always having to make a budgetary choice and you're erring in favor of the privileged versus those who need that bus for the livelihood. So we need to find a way to reconcile both, right? The fear is that the minute, look at the Bangalore-Mysore highway. Here is public good where you've banned certain people from using it. The right, does that mean you don't build highways and does that mean you don't build fast mobility? Of course, it doesn't mean that. But the highway must necessarily, perforce, be built with roads on the side, embankments where lower speed traffic and other forms of mobility can use. The fact that you don't do that is an appropriation of public good in favor of a certain set of the population to the an exclusion of another set of the population. And that should be about, the court should needs to, the judiciary needs to intervene and throw this out, right? So, but what I'm saying is that many of us aren't even aware that fundamental social contracts are being violated here when we do things like this for our own convenience.
Fair enough. I think at all points in time, this is why it becomes difficult for you to be in government, is what you and I think are right are not necessarily free of unintended consequences to other vulnerable. And the ability to understand that and tread a fine line is what makes the job so hard. So at the end of the day, let's say I come back and try to look at how do we go forward in fixing this, because clearly one of the things you said is until there is a mandate from the constitutional side which is systemic in nature, don't rely on the goodwill of individuals. But at the same time, in order to build that cat, we have to rely on the individuals at some level to say, okay, at a national level, I would like all the cities to be self-governed and hence I do it. So that's a big campaign that needs to be done. It doesn't prevent people in the states from thinking differently and executing it. But like you said, the next person can come back and say, I don't like it to be thought that way.
Yeah.
So it can easily be struck down. Be that as it may, today we are in a situation where the city government is not happening, at least in this city where we are sitting out of. And the MLAs are continuing to do what they need to do. And there's a lot of discretionary power. And the bureaucrats are also having their own inefficiencies and incapacities that they are dealing with. It is actually looking gloomy to grow cities now, right? The capacity gap, if you start building now, if you start building the capacity, it takes so many years to build that up and catch up.
Absolutely.
And you're talking about you want to grow at 7.5%, whereas your capacity is growing at -2% or -10%. The mismatch is not being paid attention to. So what happens to politicians then? Do they just go back to their favorite projects then and say, you know what, I'm not fixing this thing. Let me just get a shiny little project and get elected back to the job because I need this job. Otherwise, I'm not going to do the next thing.
You and I, as well-intentioned as we may be, may do exactly the same thing in their place because you are confronted, like you rightly said, with a problem that is so mammoth and complex and requires changes that are far beyond your authority and control, your purview, your jurisdiction. Altering that constitutional amendment is not in the hands of an individual Bangalore development minister. That requires not only the union government, it requires it to be ratified by at least half the states, right? But we definitely, I think if those of us that are serious about urban change need to look at this way beyond running local campaigns for a cycle lane here, a bus lane there, a pedestrian crossing here, fighting a flyover there, right? And it needs to be a national campaign that says, first of all, fix the basics, fix the 74th Amendment and remove the maze and put the shall and the must and the should in there so that we are guaranteed the basics, regular elections, guaranteed devolution per capita, which is how it is at a state level devolution. accountable, sort of fiscal discipline, and a size of city government that is proportional to cities being very different in scale, size, density, volume than rural areas. You cannot possibly have the same shape and form of the government that you have in the rural areas. I would in fact advocate that we need to have a special city administration cadre. The way we have an administrative IAS, at a state level, we need to have a city administrative cadre with special skills, because administering for a state is not the same as solving, city-sized problems. In fact, there are no cities in the world that compare to, Indian cities in terms of size. The biggest cities in the world are not even don't even have a fraction of the population that a Bangalore has, a Bombay has, any of our cities have. We are that big. So this is not a solved problem. This is not a problem where we can borrow from somewhere and say, hey, they know how to do buses in Brazil, or they know how to do cycling in the Netherlands. No, they don't. They are doing it for, it's a toy compared to what we have, which means we need to invent solutions. We need the capacity to invent solutions, both in terms of the volume of government and also terms of the specialization of cadre. This rotationary cadre that says, I know how to do, animal husbandry, and rotating them into running the city's mobility is like, it fits about as well as getting men to design cities. It's literally unusable for women, right? Or children for that matter, right? We have the most child unfriendly cities on the planet. It's impossible for a child to do anything, to play, to cross the road, to go to school, to, just buy their little things from the corner store. It's impossible. Yes, we need to run a huge campaign for constitutional mandate and for sort of legally providing a very clear framework within which cities must run. That is not going to be a silver bullet, but I think it's a necessary condition before we get to the sufficient conditions. I think we need to move towards a data and evidence-based policy making in cities more than anything else, because data shows us certain things that we are simply not paying attention to. Data shows us the heavy demand for transport and the lack of fulfillment of it. Data shows us the climate crisis that we have, right? Data shows us that the labor force participation rate of women in cities is far lower than rural. And we got to ask ourselves why while the literacy rate and the education rate of women in cities far exceeds, there's a 15-20% point gap between women's education rates in cities, higher education rates in cities versus rural, there is the same 15 to 20% point gap in the negative direction between women's labor force participation in cities and in rural areas, right? And you got to ask yourself, what is going wrong in our cities that it is so hostile to, women's mobility, women's livelihoods, women's sort of professional advancement? So we need to move towards specialized cadre. We need to move towards a data and evidence-based policy making. We need to move towards understanding that a city needs to involve, and I think Jane Jacobs said it, the city is about as livable for everybody, for all of the people that are involved in decision making for the city. So long as you only have the industry captains and those of us that have a voice making the decisions for the city, it is going to be, actually it's not even livable for us, but it certainly tends to prioritize our needs. Like you perfectly said, the single pothole seems to be our problem. And I remember in the CFB, Beko Beda Sante campaign that we did in Freedom Park in 2017, where we said, let's try to see what the city wants and what it doesn't want, because we managed to assemble all kinds of cohorts, from children and, disabled population to cyclists to, to the environmentalists and, to the RWAs, students. The biggest voices that came out were not fix the potholes or, open up the parks or provide us more, suburban trains and buses. The biggest voices were money big, right? I want housing, right? Every city in India has 30 new entrants per minute. 30 new entrants per minute coming into the city that hitherto didn't live in the city. And we are completely sort of blissfully ignorant of where do these people go? First of all, how do they go? They show up at the Kalasipalyam bus stand. They don't show up at the Kempegowda International Airport, right? Which means our obsession with airport buses and mobility to the airport itself is like, in a way, it's like the most deafening, the most tone deaf thing you can do, right? Our obsession needs to be what happens after these people land up at the Kalasipalayam bus stand? How do they get to where they need to go? And where the hell do they go? Because we are not creating urban housing anywhere near the rate at which it needs to be created. So in a sense, we have absolutely no clue who is Bangalore. Where does Bangalore go? How does Bangalore live? Right? And therefore, our cities are not shaped by the people that really should be shaping the city. Right? So I think hearing of the voices is extremely important. And that is one area in which I would say Bangalore is particularly inadequate. There are many models. Recently, I was in Bombay and I took one of those, conducted tours of the city. And there is this community in Bombay, the original community of Bombay, they're called the Kolis. The Kolis are a fishing Maharashtrian community. And there is the Kolis are a reserved community. They're a scheduled caste community. And the Kolis are up and down the Konkan coast in Maharashtra and even elsewhere. And if you look at the Koli neighborhood, Kolivada, in Bombay, one of the things I noticed, right, there are a lot of negatives. For example, they don't have a proper drainage system, right? And it's, you don't have all of the facilities that you'd see in some of the sort of upper middle class areas of Bombay. But if you look at the Koli streets and the housing is extremely dense. The streets are well laid out, very narrow, and the cars and the scooters can only reach the periphery of the Koli area. So all the internal streets, in a way of looking at it, are exactly like they are inside your RWA or inside your gated community, where you don't have any vehicles come in. In fact, even the local vehicles don't come in. They're all parked just outside, within the Koli area, but just outside. Only cycles enter inside, right? So you have kids on bicycles, and that is the most that you have inside the area. And you have 10,000 families living there, right? So you can have a reasonable sized community, completely devoid of motorized traffic. Everybody parks outside and walks in, right? Or takes a cycle. You have playgrounds, you have restaurants, you have places of worship, you have, so there is no question of a pavement because the entire street is for walking or for, cycles at a certain pace. There's no traffic. And while you're surrounded by the Mumbai pollution, that area, inside that area, it also happens to be near the beach, is completely free of at least pollution due to motorization, right? Due to, emissions, right? Vehicular emissions. So there are models that we can look at that have evolved for whatever reason, not necessarily evolved intentionally, maybe even unintentionally by sort of cordoning it off. That provided we are willing to listen to those voices, there is a way to make those models work and yet not be exclusive. It is not like a gated community where someone's going to stop you, a security guard at the entrance, and say, why are you coming in? This is the opposite of that, right? This is still it's not gated, but it's still a sort of a exclusive community. But there is nothing exclusionary about it, right? Anybody can walk in and walk out, right? You have theaters there, you have all the amenities, and it is just a part of the streetscape of Mumbai, except that the entire area has narrow roads, no vehicles coming inside, all the vehicles are parked outside, right? So if you can have ward committees do that sort of thing and have that sort of control over what they want to do with their streets, how they want to zone things, it is possible, right? Which is what has happened with the Kolis, but unintentionally, because I guess development isn't happening, right? They've lived like that and they continue to live like that. What I'm saying is that if we are willing to listen to diverse voices, diverse models will emerge. For some reason, we are unwilling to listen to it. As a woman, I see that there is typically a flurry of kitchen activity in the morning, and then there is a flurry of kitchen activity in the evening in most families, right? And during the day, the kitchen activity is at a lower baseline. But the way our garbage collection in cities works, the garbage truck comes first thing in the morning and picks up the garbage, which means the garbage has been sitting overnight, feeding the rats, feeding the cats, feeding the dogs, creating all kinds of disease and, sort of stink and stench and litter and all kinds of problems in the city. What is the ideal time to pick up the garbage? Knowing how every family across India works, this is not even a cultural thing. Every single family across India is going to have dinner. You're going to generate garbage at the end of dinner. And the ideal time to pick up garbage is actually at the night time. At the end of the day, you pick up the garbage, which means you're going to have a huge slew of ecosystem problems, side effect problems completely eliminated, right? And you have exactly the opposite that is happening. Exactly the opposite. Before any garbage of the day is generated, you pick it up, and all the garbage of the day is generated and sits overnight and stews for what reason we don't know. Right. So, and this is a function of design without listening to the voice that are actually generating organic garbage. Right. So
I think it's because that's when they have the shift duties coming up in the morning. They want to sleep.
Somebody designed it that way.
They did. Yeah. But here's the two things that I want to do with you again. We have to do a gender in the city separately with you. Let's try and chalk that down for some day and help me understand how do we go forward. The politics in the city seems to be a little more messy and tricky because we have a status quo now which is going on. I don't know who's going to bell the cat, and if you think that it has to come from the top down as a systemic thing, true. And in the meanwhile, I think there is value. I don't know what you think. There is value in local pressure to start having some kind of decentralization, even if it is not formal, through pressure. Because I don't see anybody belling the 74th Amendment cat in anytime soon, because there seems to be more of a centralization happening than a decentralization, which is so unfortunate, because it should be going the other way and we should be getting more powers. And the only way we look at doing that, it is just not possible with this kind of centralization to drive any kind of solution at a micro level to solve your problems. And we have established that it is not going to be. And there are opportunities with whether it's the Kolivada kind of not necessarily an RWA. I don't think the government funds should be devolved, but it can be used as long as it comes with the constraints of no exclusivity and no prevention of
the checks and balances. Yeah.
The checks and balances need to be a precondition to say that you can do all of these things as long as you're pumping up the quality for everybody. Then it is worth, and if you're willing to pay for that as well, you're also paying for the others. So just make sure that it's publicly accessible, because it's a common good that is used by other people as well. So putting those conditions, there might be an opportunity to try and do certain interventions at the local level as some pilots to see how self-governance can happen. But today, like you said, the conditions are not being applied. The lakes are being closed, very discretionary. There are no common rules as to what you can do and what you cannot do. It's being completely ceded in control just because they're doing good work. I think there has to be some kind of awareness. On that note, I don't know if we have solved anything, but I think we have a clear understanding of what needs to be done. And at some point, we need to get back and chew at this elephant in smaller pieces in some way. The big piece is going to be...
I completely agree with you, Sathya, in that I think this does not preclude local changes, local improvements, incremental improvements, and they definitely go a long way. The fact that we have fought and got ward committees happening is a good thing, regardless of the fact that they are not the 74th Amendment is not properly set up. So there's a lot of such examples of individual cycle lanes or buses or any one of those things that have happened, and they're all positive, and we should continue to do that. None of this is to say that that needs to stop and that any of the incremental and local interventions won't improve things. They will improve things.
But it'll be ad hoc.
It will be ad hoc, and it won't be permanent, and therefore it won't last, and it at some point it may also lose its sort of the
relevance.
usefulness. And secondly, yes, we can come up with a lot of innovative solutions provided we put the checks and balances in place. And the reason I keep bringing up the fact that we don't even understand the social contract is because the people with privilege don't understand the social contract, because we don't depend on the social contract. We simply buy our water, we simply have our generators, we simply have our cars, and therefore we don't rely on it. Is all the more onus that if we are going to devolve any of this, we must put checks and balances in place as we devolve the management of these things to non-state actors, if you will. But finally, I will say that we should not give up on influencing the change to the constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
Having run national campaigns like the Women's Reservation Bill, and it has happened, while it is nowhere near perfect, right? We are able to bring the pressure to move the ball on something the parliament needs to pass and states need to ratify. It's very much possible. It is not as far-fetched, and it can very much be run locally. If each of us influences our MLAs and our state governments, and the state governments bring pressure, pass the resolution, bring pressure, it is very much possible to do. It is not beyond the pale at all. Again, it's necessary, but it's not a silver bullet. But it's necessary, is what I would say.
No, I agree with you. I think you're the fourth guest on this podcast over the past year who has said that we need to do this. We need to go and change the 74th Amendment and make these may provisions into shall provisions or should provisions. But we need to just get around to doing it, because all of us have told me it's not going to be me who's signing up that thing. But we have to convene again and see how do we bring this pressure, because it seems to be affecting us in particular, and the entire country might benefit in the long run. Thank you for the time today, Tara, and I'll definitely get back to you on the gender thing. We need to have that conversation. I need to figure out how to have that conversation with you. Bring it a front and center, that and the differently abled and the children. We need to start talking about them. Of course, the economically weaker section, I'm at a loss as to how to do that. My biases don't let me understand that well enough. So let me take my time and do the homework and get back. But thank you very much, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sathya.